Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
Hi besties, I am Dhruvyata Baskan Lashari with Corventa. Today we should discuss about the
Blake Lively believes she has the perfect case, and as she pushes forward in the discovery phase of her lawsuit, she has been filing motions to compel with a confidence that suggests, at least on the surface, that she is winning, especially since the judge has been granting many of those motions, which in turn creates the public perception that she has the upper hand. However, what casual observers often fail to recognize is that judges, particularly in employment-related cases involving alleged harassment, discrimination, or retaliation, are often careful to avoid any appearance of denying a plaintiff the opportunity to prove their claims, which means that granting discovery motions does not necessarily equate to the merits of the case being strong, because even if Blake is allowed to obtain the discovery she seeks, that does not mean the evidence she ultimately uncovers will support her allegations or be admissible in court, and this is where the reality of legal procedure starts to undercut her supposed momentum, because the true test of her claims will come under the scrutiny of dispositive motions such as a motion to dismiss, summary judgment, or ultimately a trial before a jury, and the legal bar she has to clear in each of these stages is far higher than the threshold required to secure discovery. Blake's case centers on allegations that she was harassed, retaliated against, and subjected to a smear campaign designed to damage her reputation and credibility. And she frames this as a conspiracy involving Justin Baldoni and others to silence her before she could publicly speak out against him, painting a dramatic picture of coordinated reputational sabotage. However, what she seems to have underestimated is the defense strategy of Jed Wallace, a PR consultant and agent who was not her employer, not a Hollywood mogul tied to the film, and not even directly involved in her employment relationship, yet who has become one of the most effective defendants in dismantling her claims, because his legal team has approached this not with theatrics but with cold precision, going line by line through her allegations and systematically dismantling them with clinical legal arguments, as demonstrated by their most recent filings in federal court in New York. In their reply brief, Wallace's lawyers mocked her attempt to overcome the defamation exception, noting that her 2-paragraph rebuttal in a 31-page brief was hardly a response at all, and this tone permeates their entire defense. Clinical, pointed, and relentless, stripping away the dramatic framing of her complaint and focusing instead on the weaknesses of her legal theories. To understand how her case is unraveling, it is important to examine the distinction between what she alleges and what the law actually recognizes, because Blake is claiming that Wallace and others launched a retaliation campaign by spreading stories that painted her as rude, tone-deaf in her marketing, and dismissive of domestic violence, and she asserts this went beyond ordinary criticism, framing it as deliberate sabotage to discredit her before she accused Baldoni. But the problem is that retaliation laws require proof of adverse employment action, tangible impacts on a person's employment status or conditions, and reputational injury alone does not satisfy that requirement, which is why Wallace's team has hammered the point that her entire claim flows from reputational harm, and under New York law, when claims seek damages for reputational injury, they sound in defamation regardless of the label attached, and therefore cannot be repackaged under alternative theories like retaliation, false light, aiding and abetting, or conspiracy, which means that no matter how she frames it, if her injury is reputational, her claims must meet the strict requirements of defamation law. This is devastating for Blake because defamation claims, especially for public figures like her, are notoriously difficult to win, given the short statute of limitations, the requirement to identify specific false statements of fact, and the almost impossible standard of proving actual malice, which requires showing that the defendant knew a statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. Wallace's brief points out that Blake has failed to identify specific actionable statements and instead couches her complaint in broad accusations of a smear campaign, which does not satisfy defamation pleading standards, and this leaves her retaliation theory fatally undermined because if it is really defamation in disguise, it collapses under its own weight. Furthermore, Wallace's team highlights the jurisdictional and choice of law problems with her claims, because she has attempted to invoke California's Fair Employment and Housing Act (FEHA) to support her case, but as the defense notes, FEHA only applies in California, to California residents, working in California, or to conduct that occurred within the state, and Blake herself admitted that the alleged harassment occurred in New Jersey and that she pursued the case in New York, which means California law has no application, and California courts have been clear on this issue time and again. FIHA does not apply extraterritorially, period. Wallace's team pounced on this contradiction, pointing out that Blake's own admissions make FIHA inapplicable, calling it fatal to her entire legal framework. Because if her claims are grounded in FIHA but she has no basis for invoking that statute, then not only her claims against Wallace but her broader case collapses, because the foundation is legally unsound. She attempted to salvage her position by arguing that the decision to retaliate was made in California, pointing to connections with entities like Wayfarer, a California-based company, but Wallace's lawyers shredded that argument by pointing out that her allegations of overt acts are plainly rooted in New York and New Jersey, not California, and courts have consistently rejected attempts to anchor FIHA claims to decision-making in California when the actual conduct and impact occurred elsewhere, which makes her reliance on FIHA a clear example of forum shopping, where a plaintiff tries to bring claims in a jurisdiction with favorable laws despite lacking a legitimate basis to do so, and judges generally frown on such tactics. Beyond these procedural and jurisdictional flaws, Wallace's team also points to contradictions in Blake's own testimony and pleadings, noting that her complaint repeatedly ties the harm she suffered to reputational damage, undermining her attempt to reframe it as retaliation or employment-based harm. As the legal proceedings continued to unfold, it became increasingly evident that the courtroom was less a stage for celebrity theatrics and more a proving ground for the resilience of precise legal argument. And while Blake Lively may have initially believed that her star power and the narrative of a wronged woman battling systemic retaliation would carry the day, Jed Wallace and his attorneys methodically transformed the case into a technical legal contest where every allegation was dissected, every jurisdictional flaw highlighted, and every attempt at emotional persuasion met with unyielding cold logic. And in this sense, Wallace's defense strategy is not merely defensive but offensive, because by reframing her claims into defamation, by pointing to her own admissions about geography, and by emphasizing the absence of concrete adverse employment actions, they are not only defending his reputation but also actively dismantling the scaffolding that holds her entire lawsuit together. And this distinction matters because in high-profile lawsuits plaintiffs often try to tie multiple defendants together under a single overarching theory of wrongdoing. Yet if the foundation crumbles, the whole edifice collapses, and here Wallace's filings are not just about severing him from liability but about exposing that the very statutes Blake has relied upon do not and cannot apply, leaving her legal team scrambling to salvage coherence. And one must understand the enormous pressure this creates for celebrity plaintiffs like Lively do not only litigate in courtrooms but in the court of public opinion. And every time Wallace's lawyers file a scathing, clinically reasoned brief that ridicules her legal theories, journalists and legal analysts seize on it, magnifying the sense that she is losing ground, and this dual battlefield, legal and reputational, becomes a paradox, because while she accuses Wallace of reputational sabotage, it is in fact her own lawsuit, with its overextensions and legal missteps, that risks doing the most damage to her credibility. And the irony is striking, because in seeking to vindicate her name she may be further tarnishing it through the exposure of weak legal arguments. And what compounds the problem for her is the very structure of defamation law in New York, which imposes extraordinary burdens on public figures precisely to safeguard free speech and robust public debate. And as a global celebrity, Blake Lively indisputably falls into the category of public figure, meaning she must show actual malice, a standard that has been repeatedly reinforced by the U.S. Supreme Court as requiring clear and convincing evidence that the defendant either knew the statements were false or acted with reckless disregard for their truth. And Wallace's attorneys stress that nothing in her pleadings meets that threshold, because the criticism she points to claims that she was rude, that her marketing was tone-deaf, that she appeared dismissive of domestic violence, falls squarely within the realm of opinion, subjective assessment, and permissible commentary, and courts have consistently held that opinions, even harsh ones, cannot be the basis of defamation, further weakening her case. And the notion that such commentary could constitute retaliation stretches the law beyond recognition, as retaliation claims require a nexus between protected activity and adverse employment action. Yet her entire theory is built on the premise that Wallace and others sought to preemptively discredit her before she engaged in protected activity, a speculative and hypothetical chain of causation that courts are unlikely to endorse. And so, in the filings, Wallace's team cuts through the drama by insisting that retaliation laws are not designed for hypotheticals, but for real, measurable consequences like termination, pay cuts, or demotions, none of which she alleges, and therefore the claim collapses at its root. And this surgical approach is precisely what makes Wallace's defense so powerful, because it denies her the ability to expand the case into broad narratives and forces it into narrow channels of law where her allegations cannot survive. And the tone of his attorney's briefs reinforces this ruthlessness, with statements like, "Her silence will speak volumes," when she fails to meaningfully respond to their defamation arguments, and while to outsiders such rhetoric may sound harsh, to seasoned litigators it signals confidence and control, because lawyers rarely risk that level of bluntness unless they are certain the law is squarely on their side, and that confidence is bolstered by precedent, as case after case in New York demonstrates the court's unwillingness to permit plaintiffs to repackage defamation as other torts or statutory violations. And here again Blake Lively's own words undermine her, since her filings consistently describe reputational harm as the core injury, even when she tries to dress it up as retaliation or conspiracy, and this leaves the judge with little choice but to see her claims as defamation in disguise. And beyond the immediate courtroom battle, this dynamic has broader implications for celebrity litigation strategies, because it highlights the risk of forum shopping, of stretching jurisdictional boundaries, and of over-relying on the allure of reputational harm in legal frameworks not designed for it. And Blake's reliance on California's FIHA is the clearest example of this miscalculation, since even a cursory review of precedent shows that FIHA is inapplicable to non-residents who were not employed in California and whose alleged injuries did not occur there. And when Wallace's attorneys point out that Blake herself admitted the conduct took place in New Jersey and New York, the court is left with little room to maneuver, and thus the FIHA claims collapse, potentially taking the rest of her case down with them. And this is devastating not only legally but strategically, because if her FIHA claims fail, the case risks dismissal at an early stage, sparing Wallace and others the prolonged exposure of discovery and trial, and shifting the narrative from Blake as a fighter for justice to Blake as a celebrity who overreached legally and suffered a humiliating defeat. And this reputational reversal may prove more damaging than any alleged smear campaign, because it carries the imprimatur of judicial authority. And once a federal judge dismisses your claims as legally deficient, it is far harder to spin that outcome as victimhood. And all of these factors converge to create a sense of inevitability about the direction of the case, not because of any bias against Blake Lively, but because of the way the law is structured and the way Wallace's team has capitalized on those structures with relentless efficiency. And while discovery skirmishes may temporarily allow her to claim victories, the substantive law remains unyielding, and unless she can produce evidence of actual adverse employment action, tie her claims to applicable statutes, and overcome the formidable hurdles of defamation law, her case is likely doomed, and that reality underscores the broader lesson. In high-stakes litigation, even celebrities cannot bend the law to fit their narrative, for courts are arenas where precision, not popularity, determines outcomes. Blake Lively's case, as it continued to unfold in the tense halls of the New York courtrooms, was no longer just a narrow dispute about alleged retaliation or isolated instances of supposed workplace hostility, but rather a sprawling labyrinth of claims, counterclaims, procedural tactics, and public relations maneuvers that began to resemble a chess game being played on multiple boards at once, with each move scrutinized not only by the presiding judge, but also by the broader public, commentators, and other parties who had vested interests in how precedent might be set. And within this complex web, Jed Wallace's motion to dismiss represented a razor-sharp spearhead slicing directly into the heart of Blake's case by methodically dismantling each of her core allegations, exposing contradictions, and demonstrating how her theory of jurisdiction, retaliation, and harassment was built on shaky foundations that could not withstand the disciplined precision of legal analysis. Because while Blake's team attempted to paint Wallace as a central figure in some broader conspiracy engineered out of California, and then tied tenuously into New York jurisdiction for strategic advantage, Wallace's attorneys hammered home the point that nothing Blake had alleged actually tethered Wallace personally to California conduct, nor did it meet the legal definitions of harassment, retaliation, or discriminatory aiding and abetting under the frameworks she herself had invoked. Instead, as his filings clarified, even if one were to assume arguendo that someone at Wayfair or in the California cluster of co-defendants had engaged in wrongful or discriminatory actions, Blake's pleadings never alleged, let alone proved, that Wallace had knowledge of such discrimination or acted in concert with retaliatory intent. and that absence of intent or knowledge undercut her claims fatally because liability in such cases required a demonstrable nexus between the defendant's state of mind and the discriminatory acts themselves, meaning that without that crucial link, her FEHA, Fair Employment and Housing Act, claims against him collapsed under their own weight, effectively dying on the vine, as his attorneys phrased it in their filings. And what made this even more significant was the broader implication that Wallace's legal strategy provided a roadmap, a blueprint, for other defendants like Wayfair to replicate when they sought summary judgment or motions to dismiss, thereby not only shielding Wallace individually but also setting up systemic defenses that could dismantle Blake's entire litigation enterprise, which at its core appeared increasingly less like a pursuit of justice and more like a calculated campaign of reputational leverage, something the defense described as reputational gamesmanship, where allegations of harassment and retaliation were less about genuine injury and more about tactical positioning to gain influence over the creative direction of the disputed film project, especially since Blake's own conduct after the alleged harassment contradicted her narrative, because rather than withdrawing from proximity to those she accused, something any reasonable victim of harassment would instinctively do, she instead pushed for more creative control, more involvement, and greater entanglement with the very people she accused, raising the inference that her allegations were serving as bargaining chips rather than authentic grievances. And when combined with her procedural forum shopping, filing a CRD complaint in California, then pivoting to New York to exploit subpoena rules that allowed her to obtain evidence without notifying affected parties, her litigation approach began to look like a patchwork of opportunistic maneuvers designed not to achieve consistency or legal clarity, but to exploit procedural loopholes, a point Wallace's attorneys drove home by citing her own admissions where she acknowledged that significant portions of the alleged scheme were carried out by California-based individuals in California, undermining her decision to anchor the case in New York and exposing the jurisdictional flaws that threatened to gut her claims not only against Wallace but also against the larger corporate co-defendants. Furthermore, her retaliation theory, as framed, lacked the basic structural elements required under law, because she attempted to argue that Wallace and others spread damaging stories about her in order to preemptively discredit her in case she ever spoke publicly, but as Wallace's attorneys emphasized, retaliation under FEHA required an actual protected activity, a tangible act like filing a complaint or speaking out, followed by an adverse action linked to that protected activity, whereas Blake admitted under oath that she had not filed an HR complaint, had not made a public statement, and in fact could not name a single article or public statement authored by Wallace that had harmed her, rendering her retaliation theory speculative at best, non-existent at worst, because speculation cannot substitute for evidence in court. And this admission was devastating given that she claimed a near-daily media blitz destroyed her reputation, yet could not point to a single Wallace-authored piece as evidence, leading his attorneys to summarize her claims as nothing more than defamation in disguise. But even there, her case stumbled because the New York court had a specific defamation exception that further limited jurisdiction, and her attempt to overcome that exception with a mere 2-paragraph argument in a 31-page filing was so flimsy that Wallace's attorneys mocked it as hardly a response at all, closing the door on her defamation workaround and signaling to the judge that Blake's claims were structurally unsound, procedurally flawed, and substantively meritless. And what made this even more striking was the efficiency with which Wallace's attorneys operated, using fewer pages and less volume than Blake's sprawling filings, yet slicing through her arguments with surgical precision, like a scalpel methodically removing layer after layer until nothing remained. And while the judge had not yet ruled on whether to dismiss for failure to state a claim or on jurisdictional grounds, Wallace's filings deliberately gave the judge multiple avenues to dismiss the case outright, essentially saying, "Even if you disagree with us here, you can still dismiss over there," multiplying the pressure on Blake's already shaky foundation. And as observers of the case noted, this was more than just legal defense. It was demolition, a controlled implosion of Blake's narrative where each support beam was systematically severed until the entire structure of her case crumbled, leaving only rubble, and the imagery was apt because Wallace's attorneys described her case as effectively dynamited, destroyed not by brute force but by precision, where her reliance on forum shopping, her contradictory personal actions, her speculative retaliation theory, and her inability to substantiate defamatory harm all combined into a collapsing edifice. And as this demolition played out, broader questions began to loom. Was Blake's lawsuit truly about rectifying harassment, or had it always been about power, leverage, and control over a Hollywood project, with the courtroom serving as just another stage for reputational battles rather than substantive justice? Questions that the jury, if it ever reached them, would inevitably have to confront. As the legal firestorm surrounding Blake Lively's lawsuit against Wallace, Wayfair, and the constellation of associated parties continued to unfold, the weight of contradictions, strategic missteps, and fatal flaws in her case only grew heavier, and by the time Wallace's team had fully laid out their response, it became increasingly clear to seasoned observers that this was no ordinary Hollywood dispute, but rather a case study in how reputational ambitions can collide with legal realities, unraveling under the spotlight of scrutiny. And the longer one analyzed her narrative, the more its inconsistencies stood out. She argued harassment but sought deeper involvement with those she accused. She claimed retaliation without having engaged in any protected activity. She alleged media smears yet admitted she could not identify a single harmful statement authored by Wallace, and she forum shopped between California and New York jurisdictions in ways that exposed her case to being gutted procedurally before it could ever reach substantive trial. And all of this was amplified by her inability to reconcile the basic legal thresholds required to sustain claims under FEHA or to overcome New York's defamation exceptions, which meant that at every point of contact with the law her case frayed, leaving her dependent on rhetoric rather than evidence, speculation rather than documentation, and procedural maneuvers rather than substantive merits. And Wallace's team was relentless in seizing on these weaknesses, reframing every allegation not as harassment or retaliation but as defamation in disguise, insisting that because she could not point to any actionable defamatory statements by Wallace himself, the jurisdictional predicate collapsed, the substantive claims collapsed, and what remained was an empty shell of litigation propped up only by the perception she attempted to generate publicly. And this argument did not merely protect Wallace but also handed Wayfair and other defendants a ready-made playbook for their own motions, effectively multiplying the destructive power of his response across the entire defense network, which is why commentators described his filings as a scalpel that cut not only through his portion of the case but through the connective tissue of Blake's entire strategy, leaving her increasingly isolated, exposed, and vulnerable to dismissal on multiple fronts. And what made matters worse for Blake was the perception that her true aim had never been simply to vindicate herself from harassment but to leverage allegations for greater creative control, because the timeline of her actions after the alleged harassment, pushing for more involvement in the project rather than withdrawing from it, did not align with the conduct of someone genuinely seeking relief from mistreatment, but instead resembled the maneuvers of someone attempting to wrest influence over a production by deploying allegations as bargaining chips. And if this case ever reached a jury, that inconsistency would loom over every argument she tried to make, casting doubt on her motives and credibility. But Wallace's attorneys aimed to ensure it never reached that point, by front-loading their dismissal arguments with multiple escape hatches for the judge to use, each independently sufficient to justify termination of her claims, whether on jurisdictional grounds, failure to state a claim, lack of protected activity, or defamation exceptions, thereby ensuring that even if the court rejected one rationale, others remained to carry the dismissal forward. And as legal analysts noted, this layered defense strategy was as elegant as it was devastating, because it gave the court not just one but many avenues to end the case, amplifying the probability that dismissal would occur and that Blake's broader litigation campaign would collapse in its wake. And indeed, what became increasingly visible was that her forum shopping, moving from California to New York to exploit subpoena rules, while clever in the short term, planted the seeds of her downfall in the long term, because it tethered her case to the very defamation exceptions and jurisdictional limitations that Wallace and others now wielded against her with lethal effect, turning her own tactical choices into weapons used to dismantle her claims. And this irony was not lost on observers, who pointed out that while discovery victories gave Blake the appearance of momentum, they were illusory, because without substantive claims that could survive dismissal, discovery was merely noise without consequence. And so the perception that she was winning began to erode under the weight of Wallace's filings, which reframed the entire narrative as one of reputational opportunism rather than harassment. And as this reframing solidified, it became evident that the very foundation of her case, the allegation that Wallace knowingly joined a discriminatory, retaliatory